What if the things we usually think signal financial success, like advanced degrees, big job titles, even just how much money you earn? What if those aren't really the main things driving whether you build lasting wealth? What if actually the most surprising factor, the thing that really dictates your financial future is, well, something more personal, your behavior, your mindset, your psychology? Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're stepping away from the spreadsheets, away from the complex investment models for a bit. We're going to explore this really fascinating, often kind of overlooked area, the psychology of money. We want to understand not just, the nuts and bolts of finance, but the human side of it all, the stuff that drives our decisions and ultimately shapes our financial lives. And our guide for this journey is the author of a really compelling article on this exact topic. It's called The Psychology of Money: Essential Mindset Shifts for Building Lasting Wealth. And it's from Startup Literature.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Yes, I wrote that article. And I also run Startup Literature. It's a platform where I really try to explore data-driven ways to build businesses and create wealth. And this whole psychology of money thing, it's something I've thought about a lot because I honestly believe it's the piece that's missing from, well, most financial advice out there. You can have all the technical know-how, but if your own behavior gets in the way, it just won't work.
That really clicks. So, okay, our mission today is to properly dig into this article. We want to pull out those key psychological ideas, find the insights you can actually use, insights that help build lasting wealth, the kind that gives you real freedom, real security, which, as you point out, often looks, well, very different from just looking rich. We really want to get why our behavior is the critical thing here.
Right. So in the article, I start by sort of challenging how we usually think about money. I mean, technically, sure, it's a medium of exchange, a store of value, all that. But focusing just on that, it's like describing a person as just, bones and muscles. It misses the point.
Right. It misses the why we do what we do with it.
Exactly. The real complexity, the real power of money, it lies in how it influences us psychologically, how it taps into our emotions, our fears, hopes, our personal history, everything. And that's why, financial success often doesn't line up neatly with things like IQ scores or fancy degrees. You see incredibly smart people make terrible money mistakes, and then you see people from, let's say, modest backgrounds who quietly build serious wealth.
And your article really points a finger at traditional financial education for missing this, doesn't it? It's all about the math, the models. It assumes we're perfectly rational, which we're clearly not always.
Oh, definitely not. The models are useful, don't get me wrong, but they kind of fall apart when faced with actual human behavior, emotions, panic, euphoria, you name it. To really illustrate this, I included two stories in the article, two real-life examples that show this disconnect between, let's call them traditional advantages, and actual financial outcomes.
Ah, yes. The stories of Ronald Read and Richard Fuscone. There's such a stark contrast. Maybe start with Ronald Read.
Sure. Ronald Read was, well, about as far from a Wall Street hotshot as you could get. He was a gas station attendant, later a janitor, lived in Vermont. Very frugal life, drove an old car, chopped his own firewood well into his 90s, just seemed like an average guy. But when he passed away, it turned out he'd amassed an $8 million fortune. And he left most of it, I think around $6 million, to his local library and hospital.
Wow. And the natural assumption is, okay, maybe he inherited it or had some secret side business. But that wasn't it, was it?
Not at all. His method was incredibly straightforward, almost boring, you could say. He just consistently saved part of his modest salary and invested it month after month, year after year, in solid dividend-paying stocks for decades. His success wasn't about some hidden genius or a complex strategy. It was purely behavioral. It was patience, discipline, and just letting time and the power of compounding do their thing.
Incredible. Now, okay, contrast that with Richard Fuscone, Harvard-educated senior exec at Merrill Lynch. I mean, the picture of traditional financial success.
Exactly. Fuscone had pretty much everything. Read didn't, on paper at least. Elite education, high-flying career, huge income. He retired early, living this apparently lavish life. Big part of that was this enormous mansion he'd borrowed heavily to buy. It apparently cost something like $90,000 a month just to maintain.
$90,000 a month. Wow.
Yeah. But then the 2008 financial crisis hit. His leveraged lifestyle just couldn't sustain the shock. He lost everything, declared bankruptcy.
So the janitor, with quiet discipline, ends up with $8 million. The highly educated Wall Street exec with all the supposed advantages ends up broke.
It's such a powerful illustration, isn't it? It really hammers home that core idea. Financial results are driven much more by behavior than by intelligence or education. Reed wasn't smarter than Fuscone. He just had the right mindset, the right habits with money. Fuscone's failure wasn't because he wasn't smart, it was behavioral. Too much debt, prioritizing the wrong things, liabilities over assets. As I stress in the article, it really boils down to understanding our own patterns, our own psychology around money.
Which leads perfectly into another key point you explore, something you mentioned you grappled with personally, this really critical difference between looking rich and actually being wealthy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people, especially when you see all this stuff showcased on social media, my first idea of wealth was pretty superficial. I was drawn to the visible stuff, the
Yeah.
fancy cars, the huge houses, designer clothes. That external image, it felt like the goal. It definitely pushed me early on. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized how often that image is. Well, just an image, a facade.
What did you find? That it's often built on shaky ground.
Exactly that. So many people who look incredibly wealthy are actually living paycheck to paycheck, or worse, they're swimming in debt to keep up those appearances. Those luxury items are often liabilities. They drain money instead of building security. Making that distinction between the outward show and the inner financial reality, that was a huge shift for me personally.
The wealth-rich paradigm, you call it.
Right. Think about it in terms of assets versus liabilities.
Yeah.
It's a basic concept, but really powerful. I touched on this in another piece I wrote about escaping the salary monkey trap. Assets are things that, generally speaking, put money into your pocket or grow in value over time. Think investments, profitable businesses, maybe some real estate. Liabilities, on the other hand, they take money out of your pocket. Things like debt payments, the upkeep on expensive stuff, or things that lose value quickly, like a brand new car driven off the lot.
Okay. So the fancy car, the massive house in this framework, they're often liabilities, not assets.
Precisely. People focused on appearing rich often load up on liabilities that constantly drain their cash flow. They're prioritizing status symbols. But the truly wealthy, they tend to prioritize acquiring assets, things that build a solid foundation and hopefully generate more income down the line. They often live more modestly than their means would allow, precisely because they're focused on building that often invisible foundation of real wealth.
And you see that perfectly with Reed and Fuscone again, right? Fuscone bought the liability, that huge mansion. Red bought assets, the stocks.
It's the clearest example. One was focused on appearance, the other on the underlying financial reality. And this isn't just about being stingy or frugal necessarily. It's a fundamental shift in what you prioritize, what you value. Is it the external validation, or is it internal security and ultimately freedom?
That's a tough shift, though. We're kind of wired to care what other people think.
We absolutely are. And overcoming that pull requires conscious effort. It requires understanding what actually contributes to long-term well-being, not just short-term status bumps. But, building wealth is really only half the battle.
Right. And the second half, which your article argues is maybe even tougher, is keeping it.
It often is, yeah. Because the very traits that can help you build wealth aggressively, things like taking big risks, being highly ambitious, always pushing for more growth, those same traits can actually undermine you when it comes to preserving it. History is just littered with stories of fortunes made and then lost.
Jesse Livermore comes to mind. Legendary trader, but also a tragic story.
He really is. As I mentioned in the article, Livermore made an absolute killing shorting the market before the 1929 crash. We're talking billions in today's money. Just incredible timing and skill. But then, through continued aggressive, highly leveraged bets, he lost it all again. And tragically, he took his own life just a few years later. It shows that making a fortune and keeping it can require very different skills, different mindsets. He had the first, but maybe not the second.
It's the core idea for preservation. You call it the survival principle.
Yes. It's basically recognizing that the most important goal isn't necessarily squeezing out the absolute highest return possible every single year. It's making sure you survive, that you stay in the game long enough for the real magic compounding, seizing opportunities to work. Because extraordinary success, whether it's in investing, building a business, even just advancing in a career, it takes time. You need that staying power to ride out the inevitable storms, the downturns, the unexpected life stuff.
Right.
Avoiding the knockout blow is key.
And impatience is lethal to this survival idea.
Totally lethal. Warren Buffett's early partner, Rick Guerin, is the example I use there. Buffett described him simply as being in a hurry. Guerin used a lot of leverage, got caught in a market dip in the 70s, and was forced to sell his Berkshire Hathaway shares back to Buffett for cheap. He missed out on literally billions in future gains simply because he couldn't or wouldn't wait. He didn't have the staying power.
So a key tool for actually implementing this survival principle is the concept of margin of safety.
That's right. It's a cornerstone idea from Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing. I talked about it in more detail in my article on essential wisdom from the intelligent investor. Graham used it mainly for stock picking, buying something for significantly less than its estimated real worth. That gap provides a buffer if things don't go perfectly.
But the principle applies much more broadly than just stocks, like building buffers everywhere in your financial life.
Exactly. It's about applying that buffer mentality across the board. It means things like spending less than you earn consistently, maintaining a really solid emergency fund, keeping some flexibility in your plans and your thinking, setting realistic timelines, not overly optimistic ones, and importantly, diversifying your income streams if possible. So if one source takes a hit, you're not completely sunk. It's basically acknowledging that uncertainty is real, unexpected things will happen, and you need those shock absorbers built in.
And the biggest fight in actually doing this is often internal, right? Our own psychology, overreacting to short-term noise.
That's usually the crux of it. Our emotions are powerful. They scream at us to sell everything when the market tanks or to pile in with borrowed money when things seem euphoric. We get fixated on the daily news cycle instead of the long-term picture. This is where having what I call a balanced temporal perspective is crucial. It's about being vigilant and realistic about the short-term risks, yes, but pairing that with a fundamental optimism about the long-term potential for growth and recovery.
Like Graham's famous analogy of the market being a pendulum always swinging too far towards fear or greed.
Exactly. And Charlie Munger's incredibly simple but profound rule. The first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. Staying the course requires discipline. It requires resisting the urge to let your emotions or short-term headlines derail your long-term plan. Building wealth that lasts. It needs financial skills, sure, but maybe even more. It needs that self-awareness, that psychological resilience. You have to build the wealth and build the capacity within yourself to keep it.
Building the capacity to keep it, that's key. Now, looking at the financial world, it can feel a bit chaotic. There seem to be so many different ways people approach investing, sometimes even contradictory ways.
It definitely can seem that way.
Yeah.
You have, the value investors like Buffett and Graham focused on finding intrinsic worth, buying things for less than they're worth, solid fundamental analysis. But then you have completely different approaches. Momentum trading, for example, which is much more about market trends, crowd psychology, trying to anticipate what other people will do next. Think about bubbles or how some assets with maybe little intrinsic value can skyrocket. It's a different game.
And your article makes the point that just dismissing some strategies as, say, irrational kind of misses the mark because different people are genuinely playing different games with different rules and goals.
Precisely. There isn't one single correct way to invest or build wealth that applies to everyone all the time. Nicholas Darvis, who I wrote about in another piece, Can You Really Get Rich Quick in the Stock Market? Made a fortune using a system based purely on price momentum and volume. His game was totally different from Graham's. The real insight here is that success often comes down to alignment. Aligning your chosen strategy with your specific goals, your time frame, and this is crucial, your own psychological makeup. Taking generic advice that was perfect for someone playing a different game, well, it's probably not going to work out well for you.
Understanding the different games is one thing, but you also highlight how our own personal background, our history, really shapes which game feels right to us, or at least how we see money generally.
Oh, massively.
Yeah.
Our financial worldview isn't something we just logically decide on. It's deeply influenced by the economic times we grew up in. Our formative years really leave a stamp. Different generations literally see money and risk differently because of this.
Yeah, like someone who lived through the Great Depression might view stocks very differently than someone who came of age during the 90s tech boom.
Exactly. Or think about experiencing high inflation versus decades of stable prices. It shapes your instincts about holding cash versus hard assets. It's deeply ingrained. I actually saw this play out in conversations with my own mother about spending habits.
Oh, really? How so?
But she grew up in a completely different economic reality, different levels of stability, different social norms around money. So her baseline for what feels like sensible or prudent spending is just different from mine. Something that feels normal or even necessary to me might seem wildly extravagant from her perspective. It's not that one of us is right and the other is wrong. It's just that our lived experiences created different mental frameworks for what's safe, what's possible, what's reasonable when it comes to money.
That really resonates. It's like we all carry around these financial biases based on our past. Maybe we don't even fully realize they're there.
Exactly. And recognizing those biases is so important. First, for understanding ourselves, how might my own past experiences be skewing my decisions now? Second, for understanding others. Why might someone from a different generation or background have a totally valid yet different perspective on money? It allows for much richer, more nuanced thinking.
So, a huge part of figuring out your own financial path is that self-awareness, understanding your psychology, your biases, and finding the game that actually aligns with who you are.
Absolutely. It really comes down to crafting your unique path towards what you define as financial freedom.
And your article offers a great redefinition of financial freedom, too. It's not just about piling up cash.
No, not at all. For me, true financial freedom isn't just hitting a certain net worth number. It's about gaining real autonomy over your life. It's the ability to control your time, to choose how you spend your days, to work on things that actually energize you, to decide who you spend your time with. Even activities you love can start to feel like a drag if you have to do them on someone else's schedule or terms.
And typical employment, even if it pays well, often involves trading away a lot of that time and autonomy for the paycheck. The golden handcuffs, right?
Often, yeah. And breaking free from that, it usually requires more than just putting some money aside. My own path, which I talk about a bit in the article, involved pretty aggressive saving and consistent investing from quite early on. But it was also coupled with a conscious decision to live relatively simply, to keep my desires modest. That approach worked for me because it aligned with my values and my primary goal of gaining independence sooner rather than later. But it's definitely not the only way. It's just one possible blueprint.
The crucial part seems to be personalizing it, finding the strategy, the path that genuinely fits you.
Precisely. Your journey needs to be tailored to your unique situation, your goals, your personality, your circumstances. The article briefly mentions various avenues, stocks and bonds, real estate, starting or buying a business, maybe alternative investments. But success in any of these depends less on picking the right category and much more on doing an honest self-assessment first. What's your real tolerance for risk? Not what you think it should be, but what it actually is. How much time and energy can you realistically commit? What skills or knowledge do you already have? And maybe most importantly, what kind of activities actually energize you versus drain you?
It's finding that sweet spot where financial opportunity meets your own capabilities and, frankly, what you enjoy doing.
That's it, exactly. It requires some real self-reflection. And as you figure that out and start moving forward, there are some core principles from the article that kind of act as universal guideposts, regardless of the specific path you choose.
Okay, let's quickly recap those key principles for building that lasting success.
Sure. First, always remember the huge role of psychology. Your behavior matters more than your technical expertise. Second, focus on building true, often invisible, wealth through assets, not just on the superficial appearance of being rich. Third, develop strategic patience. Let time and compounding do their work. Resist those short-term emotional reactions. Fourth, maintain strategic flexibility. Be able to adapt when needed, but stick to your core principles. And finally, fifth, create personal alignment. Make sure your financial strategy truly reflects your values, your goals, and your unique psychological makeup.
So it really boils down to mastering yourself as much as mastering finance. It's not about finding the single right answer out there, but about developing your right answer.
That's the heart of it. Financial freedom ultimately is about structuring your life so that money becomes a tool that serves your most important goals and values, rather than being a constraint that dictates all your choices. It's about building your own approach, grounded in these timeless psychological and strategic principles.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. Okay, to wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a lot, how understanding your own financial psychology is really, number one, the crucial difference between looking rich and actually building wealth, and why finding a path that's genuinely aligned with you is essential. And maybe here's something to chew on as you go about your day. Thinking about your own financial background, your own potential biases we talked about, how might that awareness change the very next money decision you have to make? Are you leaning towards buying an asset that builds security, or maybe a liability that projects a certain image? Just something to consider.
And if you want to explore these ideas further, you can read the full article, The Psychology of Money, Essential Mindset Shifts for Building Lasting Wealth, and also check out those other pieces I mentioned on escaping the salary trap, Ben Graham's wisdom, getting rich quick or not, and the types of investors. They're all available over at startupliterature.com. I share insights there regularly on data-driven approaches to startups and building wealth, grounded in these kinds of principles. I'd love for you to visit and subscribe to continue the conversation.
Fantastic. That's startupliterature.com. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this today. It's been incredibly insightful.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another look into the ideas that shape our world.